So with that introduction, I'd like to move on to the presentations. We'll start with Dr. Saffel's presentation. She's the state climatologist and the Drought Monitoring Technical Committee co-chair. She's going to talk with us about drought status and the Monitoring Technical Committee activities. Take it away.
Great. Thank you very much. Very good. And thank you for the introduction. I'm Dr. Erin Ann Saffel, Arizona.
Maybe Mark, is it your computer or?
Thank you. Arizona State Climatologist. Good to see everyone. I'm going to be talking about how statewide precipitation through April's been. It's been just slightly above average for the water year, which is good, but the state has also been very hot, and that impacts our long-term drought. So we'll talk about those kinds of details. Next slide, please. So you may recall last summer, we came out of a very hot monsoon last summer, and temperatures still stayed hot across the state. Last October to December, that was the 5th hottest October to December on record. The monsoon season, we had a late start. We actually did get some precipitation. September actually had about average precipitation, and that continued in the southern tier. So toward the end of last year, so you can see October to December, we did have precipitation in the southern counties, and they ended up with about average precipitation from October to December, while the rest of the state was dry. Next slide, please. So then January through April somewhat cooled off. It was still warm, but somewhat cooled off from what we had last year. And it brought in fairly good amounts of precipitation, especially in Pima County. April had a few warmer days. Phoenix hit their first 100-degree day on April 21st. That was a bit early. Tucson hit their first 95-degree day on April 22nd, which is about average. Actually, Maricopa and Cochise counties both had their wettest April in 20 years this year, since 2004. Next slide, please. All right, so for the water year, statewide temperatures have been much warmer, and the state ranks the 13th warmest October to April on record. Apache, Cochise, Coconino, Mojave, Santa Cruz, from October to April, they all landed in their top 10% warmest October through April. Next slide, please. For the water year, looking at precipitation, most counties had about average to above average precipitation for the water year. Pima, Santa Cruz, Yuma landed in their top 24th to 26th wettest October to April. Mojave County had their 49th driest October to April. Next slide, please. All right, so now we're looking at snow water equivalent charts. A cold system at the end of April actually dropped measurable precipitation in the Little Colorado Basin and in the Verde Basin, and you can see that impact on these charts at the end of April. Looking at maximum snow amounts, that happened in February for the Salt and Verde Basins, but for the Little Colorado Basin, that happened at the end of March. Snowmelt ended in the Salt Basin around April 22nd. All in all, it wasn't a bad snow year, about average, looking at these charts. Next slide, please. And so with the precipitation, what we're looking at for October through April for our water year, statewide precipitation, we're at 6.86 inches, and that's a little bit wetter. Arizona, when we compare to last year, was much wetter last year. Last winter was amazing, and that really helped pull us through for water year 2023 because of our very dry summer last year. So looking at what we're dealing with, we're a little bit above the long-term average. Statistically, Arizona, the monsoon adds about half of water year precipitation. That's for central and northern counties. If we look at southern counties, they can add 2/3 to 3/4 of water year precipitation. So we'll see what we get. Mark, I'm sure you're going to be talking a little bit more about that. Next slide, please. So this is an interesting way of looking at where we stand for our water year. So pull out Arizona. You can see this is the Southwest, and this is the Scripps Center for Western Weather and Water Extremes. looking at statistically what are the odds of getting 100% precipitation for our water year. And you can see in Arizona, kind of in the southern tier, a little eastern counties, it's possible that we might hit 100% of water year precipitation. That's based on what we've received to date and what the average amount is for the rest of the water year. It's not saying, it's no guarantee that this is going to happen, but it's just saying that it's possible. Interesting to look at the atmospheric rivers this year. There were 51 that hit the west side of the country. Last year, there were 38. But there were more this year that hit the Pacific Northwest. And so that means that Arizona didn't really have that same impact with atmospheric rivers this winter as we did last winter. Next slide, please. So looking at this January to April, that's actually the 23rd wettest January to April on record for the state. So even though it was a bit warmer, there was more moisture, which allowed extreme short-term drought to be removed from the state. However, compared to last year this time, you can see that short-term drought persists in many parts of the state. Next slide, please. So the bigger issue is how hot it remains across the state. When we measure long-term drought in Arizona, we also take into account temperature because a hotter atmosphere is a thirstier atmosphere. So the hotter temperatures are still playing a role in our long-term drought. You can especially see that in Maricopa County. Next slide, please. And that's what I have. Thank you. If there are any questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Thank you. Questions from members first around the table? Stephen.
I have one question. On the southern Arizona, you talked about precipitation higher in Pima County in southern Arizona, but kind of the more extreme drought that's left short term is in Cochise County. Did that area not get, or is there another reason why that's still kind of more extreme?
So I think drought? Actually, Mark, you're going to be talking about that a little bit. We've been talking about that on the short-term drought slides, looking at maybe bringing them a little bit more closer into areas. I think that's what we understand. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen.
Anyone else around the table? If not, members online, you can raise your hand or go into the chat. Maggie will let me know if there's anyone online that would like to ask a question. We're not seeing anyone online for the members asking questions. So thanks, Dr. Saffel, and we will move on to the second presentation. And that's going to be the weather outlook for 2024. Mark O'Malley, lead forecaster for the National Weather Service and the Drought Monitoring Technical Committee co-chair, will lead us through that presentation. Mark.
Thank you, Director Brushatsky. I'm having all kinds of technical issues today. Go to the next slide. We'll start off by looking at the sea surface temperature anomalies across the Pacific. And really, I really want to bring your attention to is kind of along the equator into the middle of this image, as we're at the very end there. But notice the blues and starts as oranges, warmer than average, and traveling from east to west. But notice there's some pops of blue in there. And what this is this is the El Nino that's decaying. We had El Nino all winter. That's decaying. And now there's blue at the very end of the image. These are the first vestiges of the La Nina phase that will build over the summer and become established over the winter. So that's going to be our largest climate driver for the next 12 months is going to be this La Nina development. I will also note, if you look along the west coast of the United States and the Baja, notice how all those yellows and oranges turn blue towards the end of this image. That's indicating some cooler than normal waters forming off the west coast of the Baja. Conceivably, this could delay some moisture return for the monsoon this summer. This area can switch around really quickly, but this is something we'll be watching going for the next couple months to see if this inhibits some of the moisture return. Next image, please. So the outlook for our La Nina, shows a fairly good agreement among these models. And I know there's a lot of spread, but typically this time of year in the spring, we have fairly large uncertainty with respect to the ENSO, the El Nino La Nina outlook. However, this year, a little bit better agreement that by July, August, September, we'll be dipping down towards the La Nina threshold. That's that blue line at minus 0.5. And then by the next fall and winter, there's fairly good agreement that we'll be in a full-fledged La Nina state. Now, the question is, how quickly do we get to La Nina, and how big does this La Nina occur? How big does it get? Go to the next slide, please. And this just shows the probability outlook. And given our excellent model agreement, we have very good confidence, better than 80% chance that we'll be in a full-fledged La Nina by the fall and winter of 2024, 2025. Next slide, please. So our outlook for the summer, first of all, not surprisingly, the odds are tilted in favor of above normal temperatures. Go to the next, click once more. For Phoenix, it's almost a 60% chance that we're warmer than average this summer, only an 11% chance that we're below normal. We haven't seen really any below normal summers recently. And if you click once more, this is the reason. We are definitely in a warming trend. Climate regionally is warming at 0.6 degrees Fahrenheit per decade. This has been a consistent trend for the past 40 years or so now. And click once more. Even the last coolest summers we've seen from 2013 to 2017, what we would consider a moderately warm summer nowadays, 40, 50 years ago, that would have been one of the warmest summers we ever experienced. So last summer was quite warm. 2020 was the record breaker. We're seeing more of these really warm summers over and over. There's no sign of this slowing down anytime soon. So we need to plan for a future of enhanced evapotranspiration during the summers and extra soil moisture deterioration due to the excessive heat that we'll continually see. We can hope that summers coming up, we see more summers like 2013 through 2017, but obviously looking at this chart, those are going to be just the blips against the trend. Next slide, please. So I know this is a lot of data here, but I did want to show us, this is the past 6 summers where we've had an El Nino decay and we've entered a La Nina phase. It's a lot of data, I understand, and this is the July through September % average of precipitation. A lot of reds in California, so they generally don't see a lot of rainfall. I mean, most summers they don't, but particularly in this setup, over Arizona, it's a mixed bag. Very mixed bag indeed, where some areas in some years have received exceptional rainfall during these types of summers, and other areas, even in the same summer, 100 miles away, receive very little rainfall. The good news is when you look at the upper basin areas, those have generally been near average. So we can hope that this summer for the upper basin ends up near average and not too hot. So when we head towards the next water year, we don't have the same issue of really dry soil moisture going into it. So go to the next slide, please. Unfortunately, our forecast from the CPC for the summer, the odds are tilted for below normal for most of the western, or the Colorado River Basin for sure in the western United States. And it's really the most pronounced in Southeast Arizona, and Southeast Arizona sees about half their annual rainfall during the monsoon. Stephen asked earlier why Cochise County was kind of still left in D2 area. Last summer, no one in the state did very well precipitation-wise. And because they receive half their rainfall in the summer, that's kind of why they're more of a holdover than the northern parts of the state, which have experienced good rain and snow over the past 2 consecutive winters. Click once more and we'll look at the trends and the outlooks. So for Phoenix, a little bit of a shift towards drier than average, but overall there's still better than a 25% chance that we could see above average. Those blue dots on that graph are the previous 6 years that I showed. There's really no long-term trend. There's just high variability during the summer months, and that goes to how monsoon thunderstorms work. The good news is 4 of those past 6 years were near to slightly above average. no extreme values in any of those 6 years. So if you're going on the analogs, probably looking at a fairly average monsoon coming up, a lot of hits, but a lot of misses as well. Best case scenario, I think, is some of the headwater areas get good rainfall, so we don't deplete the soil moisture as badly in those areas. Going to the next slide, please. Looking towards next winter, I know a lot of water managers will want to prepare for the next water year. Unfortunately, heading into a La Nina, this is forecast based largely on the La Nina composites. With a few exceptions, a couple years ago being one of them, almost all winters of La Nina in the Southwest United States are drier than average. So as a water manager, I would definitely plan that next water year would be below average as far as total rain and snowfall amounts. When we get to this meeting in November again, obviously we'll get a better update on this outlook. So go to the last slide, please. And this is just a summary, but really warmer than average this summer is almost a given, seeing what our trends have been over the past 30 to 50 years. Slight increase in odds for a drier monsoon, but there's a lot of randomness in the thunderstorms in the summer. And I think our best case scenario is the headwater locations get above average rainfall and our soil moisture goes into next water year okay. But I expect this summer there'll be a lot of people that hit okay, but a lot more that actually miss the good rainfall. And then really good high confidence of La Nina next year, and I would plan for a drier winter. So with that, I will take any questions.
Thanks, Mark. Questions from members around the table first? Seeing none, questions from members online, I'll pause so you can contact Maggie. We're not seeing anyone, so I have a question. Dr. Saffel talked about all the atmospheric rivers this past winter. Is there any correlation to those atmospheric rivers to La Nina, El Nino?
Winters, you seem to have more atmospheric river events, and they seem to be directed more towards Southern California and Arizona during La Nina versus La Nina years. You still get atmospheric rivers in La Nina, and it's proven 2 years ago. If they line up right, it works out great for us. But in general, you get less of them in the La Nina winters. So that's where that disparity comes from between El Nino and La Nina.
Great, thank you. Okay, we will move on to the next presentation. Colorado River Water Supply Update. James Hefner, our senior hydrogeologist in the Colorado River Management section of DWR, will give that presentation. James.
Thank you, Director. No. Some feedback on my end. I just wanted to compete here. Is this a little, am I okay now? No. This is slightly better. Apologies. Always like to start that off. James Hefner, again, Colorado River, just to be brief, but we'll go ahead and roll into the next slide. So the current system status as of the 12th, Lake Powell and Lake Mead, 34 and 35% full, respectively, about 7.93 million acre feet in storage in Lake Powell, a little over 9.2 million acre feet in Lake Mead. Elevation Lake Mead was about 1070. We're in tier 1 shortage conditions this year, obviously. Looking at the smaller upper reservoirs, Flaming Gorge is 87%, Blue Mesa at 67%, and Navajo at 68%. Total system storage is 42% full, 24.5 million acre feet. That's an improvement over last year, which was 36% full, little under 21 million acre feet. Next slide, please. So as to where we might be headed next few months, on the left we have the snowwater equivalent for the upper basin, the SWE chart, if you will. We've got 2023 in dark blue, 24 in dark blue. 2023 is obvious because it was a fantastic water year for snow. The medians on there, 2001, 2010 are also included. The early part of the water year, we started off a little behind, we're below median. Actually had some improved conditions in the early part of the year. Moved us above median, was looking, looking better, getting a little excited. But then April was warmer and drier. Started seeing some of the melt come off. Didn't have any real new accumulation in the upper basin, so we fell below. There were a couple events in May, which have kind of at least pushed us more towards the median. We peaked in April 4th, 111%, but like I said, we're currently not looking quite so impressive. On the right, of course, is the cumulative 7-day average runoff. And again, you see here, at least where we are running slightly below median. Again, much different picture than last year. Next slide, please. Okay, this is busy, but it's informative nonetheless. This is obviously from the River Forecast Center. It shows the range of the forecast over time. We have a very wide range of estimates early on, and then that is improved as obviously as we move forward in time. Get more information, there's less error. And as far as the forecasts themselves, you can see it more or less, mirrors what we saw with the SWE chart. I mean, we started out below median, below average. We see improvement increasing through March, hit April, and then of course we start declining again. The last official forecast from the Forecast Center as of May was 5.1 million acre feet. That's still where it is today. And as far as the official mid-month, they have not changed that. That's down about 600,000 acre feet from what it was in April. Next slide, please. Yes. Oh, okay. Certainly. That's the one right there. No, this is. Okay, so as for what this means for the water year, it's in whole. The forecasts, again, as of May, range from 6.8 to 9.35 in the min and the max probable. The most probable is 7.79, 81% of normal. Again, this is down 600,000 acre feet from where it was in April. Here again, I've got, 2001 and 2010, those water years, at least for the snowpack, were relatively similar in magnitude and pattern. They more or less mimic what's going on with the min and most probable year forecasts. So well, that's fine. I mean, the real question is what happens next year. Is, are we fortunate enough to, have something from like 2017 to 2019 as a sequence? Unlikely. That'd be awesome. Or do we have something that's like 2019 and 2021, which is would obviously be not awesome. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, these are as for the reservoirs, the elevation forecast projections from reclamation. These are from the May 24-month study. Usually I like to include the CRIMS runs in here as well, but they were not available at time of presentations. You lose some of the possible variability and in the ultimate results on the projections, but this is nonetheless still informative. End of calendar year 2024 in Lake Powell, we're looking at 3573 feet for the most probable. The probable min is 3562 feet. End of 2025, looking at 3582 for the most probable and 3550 for the probable min. All of these assume release from Lake Powell of 7.48 for 24 and 25, with the exception of the probable maximum, which has a release of 9.0 million acre feet in 2025. Next slide, please. This should be my last one. This is of course, the mean projections, mean elevations. End of calendar year 2024, 1061 for the most probable, 1060 for the problem in, not much difference there. Surprises. End of calendar year 2025, we're looking at 1060 for the most probable and 1048 for the problem in. Obviously, as mentioned before, we're in the tier 1 shortage this year, next year as well, tier 1 reductions, with the possibility of going back to level 2 shortage or tier 2 reductions, depending on the hydrology in 2026. And with that, if there are any questions, you have to answer.
James, I have one question before I ask the members. So the federal government put out a record of decision on their supplemental EIS that chose as the preferred alternative the lower basin plan to have 3 million acre feet of conservation through 2026. How much conservation, do you know the number, James, is embedded in that Lake Powell projection chart for the 24-month study?
All that should be missing from that is the IID agreement. It's about 750,000 out of that 3 million. As far as what's in the modeling, it's
So about 2.25 or so, right?
right.
And I just bring that up because obviously without that water, those elevations in Lake Mead would be significantly lower. We're about 70,000 acre feet for a foot right now.
70, 80, yeah. Yeah, between the 2023 hydrology and the conservation actions, we were much better as the reservoirs go.
So we are making a significant impact, positive on the positive side to those programs. Members have questions for James? Members around the table? How about members online? All right, thanks, James. We'll move on then.
This is that.
Presentation. Salt River and Verde River Watersheds Water Supply Update. Stephen Flores, Senior Hydrologist from Salt River Project, will lead us through that presentation. Go ahead, Stephen.
All right, thank you. So I'll provide an update on the Salt and Verde watershed and SRP water supply. For this year, it was a fairly normal winter. Now, that's not talking that it was a typical winter, but statistically, overall, for the winter runoff season, we were very close to both normal precipitation and to our median runoff on the Salt and Verde watershed. There's a couple differences. As was mentioned last year, we saw 400% of runoff, and that was in a La Nina year. This was an El Nino year, but there was a couple differences. One being that we started out, from you look at this graph, the dashed line is last year, the solid green line is this year. We started out very dry. So, and both this year we saw a drier monsoon. Before last winter, we saw a wetter monsoon. So even beyond this graph, that trend was continuing. So we saw drier conditions going into the winter. Versus last year. And then the storms we did see starting a little bit in January, and then most of the storms we observed on the Salt and Verde were in early February and then late March. But the difference there with those storms is last year we saw much higher intensity of storms, in much more higher average precipitation in those storms. So we saw much more runoff produced. This was more adding to snowpack, but we were late in getting that snowpack established. So it wasn't really till that early February we started to establish a snowpack across the watershed. And then those late March and early April storms started to produce some of that runoff across the watershed. So we were about 10.8 inches for the water year so far, which is just slightly above normal at 108%. Next slide. So if we look at that, this was just some images. The images on the top is along the Verde watershed, there near Munns Park area. This was in February, right after those first larger snowstorms that we saw. You can see there's about 1.5 feet of snow there. But then by mid-March, you can see that most of that snowpack was depleted, especially on the Verde. The Verde kind of melted out after that first. We saw that dry stretch in late February, early March. So it kind of melted out. And then when we saw those March storms, particularly on the Verde, we did get some good precipitation along the rim, the Mogollon Rim and the Verde and Tonto watershed, as well as in the White Mountains. We saw about 3.5 inches in March. which was well above normal, but most of that was in the second half. And on the Verde, it basically had to reestablish that snowpack. On the salt, it did keep its snowpack for a lot of the area, so it did add to the salt across the watershed. Next slide. So if we look at where we were April 1st, snowpack overall in the Salt and Verde, we were about 317% of median. Now it was mentioned that the Verde was above median, but it's not hard to be above zero. The Verde typically doesn't have a snowpack as of April 1st. Last year, the Verde had a exceptional April 1st snowpack, the largest since 1973. That was not the case this year. It was mostly melted out. But we saw an actual better snowpack as of April 1st this year. So the Salt actually had a better snowpack as of April 1st. Not as much runoff until then, but it was the largest snowpack since 2010 on the Salt side. And you can see some images there on the White River and the Black River headwaters, completely coverage in those higher elevations of 8, 9, 10,000 feet elevation, 5, 6 feet in some areas of the higher elevations. So you can see that we were fairly close. We started out slow, but the snowpack got most median until we saw those early Februaries came up, melted out, and then went above median again later in April. What that meant for runoff, next slide, on the Salt and Verde, is that we didn't have a whole lot. January, if you go to the next slide, we can, one area before I talk about the runoff for the Salt and Verde was C.C. Cragen watershed and C.C. Cragen Reservoir up on the Mogollon Rim north of Payson. It did get enough snowpack, especially with that second surge in late March and early April, that it did fill to capacity. So we saw enough snowpack along the rim there to fill C.C. Cragen Reservoir to 100% in early April. It spilled a small amount, about 4,200 acre feet of water throughout the month of April, and then until late April, and then in May, pumping operations for deliveries to Payson and into the Verde started. Next slide. So overall, for runoff on the Salt, Tonto, and Verde River, you can see we saw a small amount from that February snow, but a lot of that was snow. We saw a small response from that, 1,000 or 2 CFS peak runoff on the Salt and Verde and Tonto. But January, February, and March were all below median runoff. We didn't catch up this year until April and May. We saw a very good April runoff from that snowpack. So April kind of caught us back up to median runoff. As of mid-May, we're about 442,000 acre feet. Right now, I just checked it this morning, we're about 450,000 acre feet, and that is about median right there. So we expect to be slightly above at 470,000 by the end of May. For the January through May runoff season to be about 105,000 or 105% of median runoff for the winter. So fairly close to median, which is actually, this is the first median runoff that's been anywhere close to median in the last decade. 2013, I believe, was the last one that was fairly close. Everything's either been well below median or well above median. So we've either had very dry years or very wet years. This was the first median by the numbers that we've seen. Next slide. Overall, the reservoirs didn't quite fill this winter. We got to about 93% at the end of April. Right now, mid-May, they're about 92% with 2.1 million acre feet of storage. Last year, we were still at 99%. So, and we had just stopped spilling from the salt runoff from last year. But this year, we did not spill any water from the reservoirs, either the Salt or Verde. The Salt Roosevelt got up to about 97% full. And the Verde reservoirs between Horseshoe and Bartlett got up to a peak of about 70% full. Currently, here in early May, the inflows have started to drop below demand, so reservoirs are starting to slowly now on downward trend. We expect that to continue throughout the summer as inflows drop out and demand picks up. We did increase from 81% as of January 1st to 92% between there, or 93% beginning of May. The water deliveries that were on the Verde for typically in the winter, they did swap over to the Salt in early April. And so you have primary releases from Stewart Mountain Dam, about 950 CFS, and the typical summer release is about 125 CFS coming out of Bartlett right now. This year, because we had the wet winter last year and we've kind of stayed on track with our planning this year, we have minimum groundwater pumping this year. So about 75,000 acre feet total of groundwater use. About 10% of SRP's deliveries is coming from groundwater. Minimum pumping, it's likely to be similar. It may be slightly higher, 75 to 100,000 acre feet potentially next year. And then we'll see from there. So that'll come out later this year. Next slide. So kind of the takeaway message for a couple of these things. We saw a drier fall and early winter with below median, and then April and May kind of caught up. We had above April, especially on the salt, on snowpack. But we did have a wet March, above median, or above normal precipitation in March. And this is one of these back-to-back wet Marches. Last year, we had a very wet March. This year, we had a slightly above normal March. First back-to-back Marches in a while. Again, also, we've had 5 out of the last 8 winters of above normal precipitation runoff on the Salton Verde. So again, most of them, except this last one, that have either been very dry or very wet. And then so we have about median runoff, and storage is currently about 92%. We didn't quite fill Roosevelt. That graph shows Roosevelt. All of the new conservation storage was mostly stored last year. So there wasn't a lot of available space, so we didn't gain any new NCS as well. It would have had to get to the last foot. We got about 3 feet short of filling Roosevelt this year. Next slide. So to kind of just wrap up, we saw kind of a median year, but I mentioned that we have very wet years or very dry years. This is the other river system. I don't know why that's up there. No, but it's point out. We've been in the last 25 years or so one of the largest or greatest mega droughts, kind of particular periods. And so the Colorado, as we've heard, continues to decline. We've heard a lot about that during that period, storage. But if you click again, if we look at the Salton Verde watershed during that same period, we've seen the Salton Verde watershed and the SRP reservoirs on that have years where it's filled and spilled. We rely on those years that fill those reservoirs, like 2005, 2010, 2023, to help us get through those periods of drought. And about 1 out of 4 years in the last 25 years, we've seen, even though we've been in a drought, we've seen more water come in than we can store in those reservoirs and had to make spill releases. So looking forward, if you click on the next slide, looking at some opportunities that SRP is looking at on how we capitalize on that in the future to help the regional water supply for Arizona altogether. And so just very briefly, just an update on 3 projects that are going on that SRP and the Bureau and many other stakeholders are involved with. One being potential how to take advantage of these wet years. One being the Roosevelt flood control space. Last winter, we got 4 feet into flood control space. Right now, we have to release that water within 20 days. So there's a project to potentially allow us to extend that period and take up to 120 days to release that water, to be able to put that more to use instead of having just to move that water out of the system in March or April when we're spilling. Now it can be to June where there's higher demand and more use for that water. And that could be there's a potential for the first 5 feet of that flood control space, which is about 100,000 acre feet of additional space potential for use. That is kind of near the finish line. It's gone through the NEPA and everything, and we're looking to get approval for that here in the next month or so. So hopefully that will be something to look at next year. The second project being a much longer term project, the Bartlett Modification Project. That is kind of more in the early stages. It's gone through appraisal and feasibility, and it's going to be starting the NEPA process and the design process in the next 3 to 5 years. And then if that would go forward, construction, that's about 10 years out, 8 to 10 years out project. But that would raise Bartlett potentially the proposed alternative would raise Bartlett about 100 feet, adding about additional 300,000 acre feet of storage. That would not just be that cities and other stakeholders could use. That would be areas that could be used off project. You can see the map there below. That purple is the SRP service area where SRP water can be delivered. This would be like NCS, where it could be delivered outside of those areas to other parts of the cities that rely on CAP or groundwater. And then lastly, the third one is the SRP CAP interconnect facility, the SCIF. That would allow, currently we can only move water from the CAP into the SRP system. This project would allow water to move from the SRP system into the CAP system and allow that flexibility to move that water between the two systems, and give more flexibility to reach those areas. So that one again is in kind of moving into the that early NEPA stage here later this year, and design phase. So, and that's more of a 3 to 5 year time frame on that one. So these are some of the things that we're working on to help kind of the sustainability of the whole regional water supply here in Phoenix and Arizona. So thank you.
Thanks, Stephen. Questions first from members around the table? Mark.
Hi, Stephen. Kind of an observation and a question. I noticed that this year SRP's basis received 108% of the total precipitation, and the runoff was 105% of median. This is the first time in several years that I think we've seen that 1-to-1 ratio. Even on the Colorado Basin this year, we saw about 100% of SW but we only saw like 80% of runoff. Is there any theories you have on why the basin this year was kind of 1-to-1? Because we haven't, even in the Salt and Verde, we haven't seen that 1-to-1 ratio recently that often.
Yeah, and there are differences, you know, with Colorado with their snowpack and getting that later in the summer and melt, whereas we get a mix of snow melt, rain. So ours is, you know, you can kind of have a year that gets like a dry year. If we didn't get some of those last storm or two in April or March, we would have been well below normal. Or if we had a wetter fall, we would have got a lot more runoff from that. You know, some of those, it being that we're not just snowmelt dependent and it's more of a rain, it can, you know, a lot of winters where we were below normal, we were just one storm. If we had another storm or two, we would have had a very good runoff. So once you get up to that, you kind of prime the watershed and get that antecedent conditions saturated, those storms can really dictate whether it swings up or swings down just by one March storm. That's why we've seen a lot of winters kind of in March, you know, kind of make the difference between a very wet winter or a dry winter. This year just happened to be that it made up for a very dry winter. What could have been a very dry winter, that wet March made up for it to get us statistically to that normal runoff. But that's kind of the difference in why we mostly see that variable. We either see it very wet and continue, and if it's in storms, or we see it dry and just kind of the storms aren't enough to get it.
Brian, up with the Farm Service Agency.
Yep.
I just noticed that historically, horseshoe. I had noticed that historically horseshoe reservoir is relatively, you know, low, and it looks like it's about 80%, which is great. You know, imagine it's been able, just because of the wet winter, two winters ago. Is that kind of is that how it's staying at, you know, 80%? And then also I noticed Bartlett is quite a bit lower than horseshoe, like 20-30% lower. I was just kind of curious about that, but it's good to see the reservoirs over there, the way they look.
Yeah, typically we you know, Bartlett would be a little higher and horseshoe be typically we would you know, empty horseshoe in the winter. Right now there's a couple reasons. We did have a wet, you know, average, you know, normal winter, which helped, you know, fill up some of that horseshoe. But there's also we do have some maintenance that's going on at horseshoe that doesn't allow us to move water currently out of the valves, and so we're using the spillway. So we're keeping it at least about 50% or higher at horseshoe. So we're not going to be drawing it down like we typically do this each summer. So it will stay at least 50% higher. It's a little higher now. We were planning a release a week or so ago, but these fires have, we've kind of waited to see just to make sure that access. So we will move a little bit more down here to raise Bartlett, but Horseshoe would remain probably 50% or higher throughout the summer and into next year because of those limitations that we have on Horseshoe operations right now.
Members online have questions for Stephen? Seeing none, so we'll move on to the next presentation. That is 2024 Wildfire Outlook. Tiffany Davila, Public Affairs Officer for the Arizona Department of Forestry and Fire Management, is with us to give us that presentation. Tiffany.
Thank you, Director. So everything the past presenters have already discussed really lay out the future for us when we're talking about the wildfire outlook and the potential for the upcoming season. Just to touch base a little on our trends in fire activity, we do get a lot of human-caused starts in the spring. Most people are outdoors working, the temperatures are a little bit cooler, so they're trying to get all of their activities done prior to the summer. So that's really when we start to see an increase in our human-caused fires. We get the red flag warnings like we had yesterday, and that really will increase our fire activity through the spring. In 2023, we had about 1,900 fires that burned nearly 190,000 acres of state, federal, and tribal lands. Of those fires, 71% were human caused. That's a typical unfortunate average for us every year. About 70 to 85% of our fires are human caused. We really start to see the shift in our human caused fires once we get into our monsoon season. Those fires then tend to become more lightning strike caused fires. The top causes of state fires, each jurisdiction is a little different. For the feds, they tend to see a lot more recreational fires, camping, campfires, and things of that nature. But for us, because our jurisdiction is not only state trust land, but private as well, we get a lot of escape debris burns. We get a lot of equipment usage, whether that's someone grinding, welding, sparks flying into the grass, starting a fire, and then target shooting, and then, of course, roadside fires. Last year, we had 26% of our fires were along Arizona's roadsides, primarily along Interstate 17, Interstate 10, some fires along the 40. Those are nuisance fires, not only to us, but to the public. They tend to jam up traffic and shut down major interstates during our busy time across the summer. Next slide, please. So as we talk about our outlook, the drought conditions persist with impacts to fine field vegetation, the grasses and the brush. As I previously mentioned, everyone here at the table that discussed the climate, the outlook for the summer, the spring, the monsoon season, all of that plays a role into our potential outlook. We have a fire behavior analyst on staff that goes out and does some ground truthing. So actually goes out into the field and looks at the vegetation, takes samples of the vegetation to see really where we are with our fuel loading in certain areas and what that water consumption is for that vegetation. So this year, we have the potential for higher than normal fire activity south of the Mogollon, across the Tonto, which we're already seeing right now, throughout the Sonoran Desert landscape, down into central, south into Cochise County, and then up north into Aravaipa Canyon, just north of Cochise County. Fuel loading in those areas is almost more than double than other areas across the state. We're already seeing our outlook turn into truth in certain areas, especially along the Tonto. They've had multiple fires already this year. Now with the Wildcat fire outside of Bartlett, we've had some fires out by Peralta, which is near Gold Canyon. And then we're seeing a lot of fire activity in the western part of Pinal County. Granted, those fires are about a half an acre, 20 acres. The largest out in Pinal County was the range fire at 2,000 acres. But what's saving us right now and has been over the last couple of weeks is the cooler overnight temperatures and the increased relative humidity. That all plays a role in fire activity. So crews were able to get some relief at night, maybe catch those fires in the early morning hours, and able to provide 100% fire suppression. As we move into the summer months, when we don't have that relief at night anymore, those fires are going to stay active through the night, they're going to become larger, and they're going to be harder to suppress. June's forecast to have normal warm temperatures. Unlike last year, our fire season was delayed by about a month because of the amount of moisture that we had that previous winter and those cooler temperatures throughout May and into June. So we really had about a 30-day delay start on our fire season. Now, I just want to remind everyone that when I say we have a fire season, we can have fires year round here in Arizona. We just really start to see that uptick in fire activity once we start moving into our warmer months. And then with the talk of the possibly drier monsoon, as Mark mentioned, that really could extend our fire activity well into July, August, September. When we have a wet monsoon season, that and it brings with it obviously the precipitation, but increased relative humidity levels. That really puts an end to our fire season. As past, we've seen that, like last year, our fire season extended into September and even October because we really didn't have a lot of precipitation. We just had dry lightning start. So we had all of that lightning with no moisture to back it up. And we were still busy pushing into September and into October. Next slide, please. So these are from last week, but you can see that, we are starting to increase with our drought more so in the southeastern part of the state and across the central region, again, where we have that potential for higher than normal fire activity. And then as compared to last year, where we were pretty much, good throughout all of the state when it came to our drought because of all of the moisture that we received that prior year over the winter. And then again, just the potential for high fire activity through down south of the Mogollon into Aravaipa and down into southeastern Cochise County area. Next slide, please. So this is kind of what we're looking at for May, June, and July. And we start talking about our outlook in January and February. And obviously, as everybody knows, things change. So we're constantly going over these again, looking at the forecast. What is the summer going to bring? What's our monsoon season going to look like? So things do change. In May, we do have that activity again, right on the money there, central Arizona down into southeastern Arizona. Same with June. And then July, we start to see it kind of wind down and just that portion of eastern Graham, Greenlee counties, and again, where Aravaipa Canyon is. Again, these could change over the next month or so, depending on what our forecast looks like and what our actual weather is turning out to be for June and into July. We do have some areas that have about 200 to 300% above average fuel loading. And that's just due to the increased moisture. Again, it's one of those double-edged swords. We get a lot of moisture. We need the moisture, but now we have all of this excess fuel loading in certain areas. Especially now where they're dealing with the wildcat fire just northeast of there. There's a lot of vegetation in that area. That some of those areas haven't seen fire in quite a while. And that's why we're seeing these faster moving fires in these areas. And that's why we have all of this increased fuel loading. And then for the high country, because they did have a wetter winter, we could see a later start in that area. Some of that vegetation still is holding moisture pretty well. So we won't see, at least now, larger fires up in the northern portion of the state. Next slide, please. And so I do have some new numbers to share with everybody. So for 2024 this year, these are year to date. These are state, federal, tribal. They're all land jurisdictions. We've had 418 fires that have burned 27,000 acres. As compared to last year, same time frame, January 1st to today, we had 413 fires that burned 7,000 acres. So you can see that we're getting fires in these areas where we have that heavy fuel loading, and they're spreading faster, and they're moving rapidly, and they're consuming more fuel. Next slide, please. So kind of just going over our past data, like I said, 1,800 wildfires last year. In 2022, 1,200 fires, 2021, 1,600 with almost 600,000 acres burned. And then in 2020, almost 1 million acres burned. That was one of our busier wildfire seasons in probably at least a decade. In 2020, we had the Bush, we had the Bighorn, we had fires in Cave Creek. So that year was very widespread for us. There was not one part of the state that was untouched by fire. Next slide, please. And so just a quick rundown of how what our resources are. We have 5 districts across the state. We've got engines, hand crews, and overhead in each district. We also work with our local cooperators, our fire departments, and our fire districts. Therefore, We have access to almost 2,500 wildland firefighters across the state, on top of our federal partner resources. We also partner with the Department of Corrections. We have 12 fire crews. Not only do they fight fire, but they also do fuel suppression work, or I'm sorry, fuels reduction work in the off season. We also have our Phoenix crew, which is a type 2IA crew, which they provide initial attack when a fire first kicks out. And then we also contract for single engine air tankers and then our air attack platform. Air attack is basically our eyes in the sky. They're used to kind of give us a bird's eye view of what the fire may be doing when a fire starts, where it's at, and then they help guide in some of the aircraft also, whether that's a very large air tanker or single engine air tankers. And then we partner with our federal partners for the use of our very large air tankers and our large air tankers. And then we also work with the Department of Public Safety for helicopter support as well. Next slide, please. Something new this year. Last Friday, Governor Hobbs signed into effect House Bill 2751. That allows us to enter the Great Plains Interstate Wildland Fire Compact. So what does that mean? That means we can go direct with those states listed there, the Dakotas, Colorado, New Mexico, Wyoming, Kansas, as well as Saskatchewan. This allows us to go direct with those states instead of asking for resources in a roundabout way, delaying those resources coming into the state. So these are based off state to state agreements. We can pull equipment, personnel, and even aircraft from those states to help when we need extra resources here. Yes, we do rely on our federal partners. Sometimes their crews are busy on their fires, so we need more resources in the state. And we can also reciprocate our resources and our personnel when we start to slow down. We can send our people out into those areas and help them when they start to get busy. Not only does it help with resource allocation in the state, but it also helps build qualifications for people. They can get out, they can experience different landscapes, different topography, different vegetation type. So they're building qualifications as well as helping other states and vice versa when they come here. And again, this is just something that is new as of Friday. Governor Hobbs signed it into effect. We will be utilizing the compact this year. We don't know when, but again, once we start reaching our increased preparedness levels, we will pull the trigger compact and start getting resources into the state. And I think that is it. Thank you very much. I appreciate your time.
Thanks, Tiffany. Questions from members first around the table for Tiffany? Seeing none. Members online, any questions? Seeing none. Thanks, Tiffany. We'll move on then to the next item. Impacts of drought on hydropower. Ed Garak, Executive Director, VIETA, will give that presentation. Ed, are you with us?
I'm Tom. Can you hear me?
Ed, can you hear us?
I can hear you. I can't hear me.
Ed, we think you're speaking, but you're muted. I don't know if it's your end or our end. We'll look at that. We're showing unmuted on our end, Ed, but we're not hearing. So we're told that folks online can hear you, but not us here in the room. So give us a second to try to figure that out. So folks online, we have our IT folk looking at this, try to figure out how to let us hear the important things that Ed has to say. Maybe, Ed, it's your Y2K. It's kind of meant.
The bug finally reared its ugly head.
Sorry, we'll all have to bear with us for a second while we get our IT person down here and try to figure out what's going on. So Ed, if you could make an accommodation, and if we could move to Scott Lund from the Western Area Power Administration, perhaps then we can go back to you, Ed, if we can figure out our technical issues. Scott, can you try to get on and see if we can hear you?
I'm here in the room, so
Oh, sorry.
hopefully you can hear me
Can't see your,
online.
you have none. No nameplate.
Well, great. Well, thank you so much for having me today. I think I lucked out a little bit. It's very difficult to follow Ed with his colorful and informative presentation. So I'll go first. I'll introduce my agency a little bit if we can get the next slide. I'll be very brief about that, but I know a lot of folks aren't familiar with WAPA. So we're one of 4 power marketing administrations under the Department of Energy, and we market wholesale electricity, the output of federally operated dams. We span about 15 states in terms of our footprint. We have 17,000 miles of transmission line. That makes us one of the largest transmission providers in the nation. And we sell our hydroelectric power to approximately 700 customers. Those are government entities, nonprofit organizations such as irrigation electrical districts, municipalities, tribal nations, military installations, and many more. We serve approximately 40 million Americans with that power, so it's a sizable amount of hydropower. The region that I'm from, headquartered here in Phoenix, the Desert Southwest region, covers Arizona, Southern Nevada, and Southern California, essentially the lower basin. And most of our operations are in Arizona. So go to the next slide, please. So Ed's going to talk a little bit about the impact of the drought to power production from a quantity perspective. I'm going to talk about some of those financial impacts. And I'll use our Parker and Davis project as an example. That's a combination of the Parker Dam and the Davis Dam. We operate them jointly from a power perspective. So they're integrated. And we sell a fixed amount of power to our customers of that project, Parker and Davis. And when hydrology is poor and the dams are not producing the output that they normally would, we go out on the open market and make power purchases to cover that shortfall. So this graph shows our energy plan for the current federal fiscal year, October through September 2024. And represented in the blue bars is the generation, the output of Parker and Davis, which is just under 1,200 gigawatt hours of generation. Then you can see in the orange colored bars on the stack graph there, that's the amount of purchases that we plan to make for 2024, about 260 gigawatts of purchases. And the left side of the graph, you can see the little bars at the bottom, the arrows, excuse me, we have our actuals for the last 6 months and then 6 months of forecasts. Those forecasts are obviously very speculative going into the summer season, and we're all aware of, you know, the turbulence of climate and the energy markets there. So in total, we're planning this year to purchase about 20% of the power that we sell to our customers. That's a healthy chunk, but certainly not devastating when you consider it just strictly from a percentage standpoint. We'll go to the next slide. So let's take a look at what this means in terms of pricing. So here we have a similar graph. Orange is the amount of the purchases we're going to make, in which you see those market prices vary. We've seen actual market prices recently fairly low, about $44 a megawatt hour. They were much higher a couple months ago. And our forecast prices for the remainder of the year vary anywhere from $38 all the way up to $148. Now, these are monthly averages around the clock, so as always, an average can be rather misleading. Times in which the system is running very heavy, if there's an energy crisis in California, like we've seen many years, or wildfire that can affect our transmission lines, we'll see those hourly prices spike upward to about $1,200 a megawatt hour. So pretty significant. Then in the blue bars, I'm very proud of that. That's the rate at which we sell our power. That wholesale power we're currently selling this year at $25 a megawatt hour. So it's generally up to about a quarter, sometimes significantly less in those high hours compared to what the market price is. Let's move on to the next slide, please. So let's kind of bring those two graphs together of the quantity we need to purchase, the Q, and the price of those purchases, the P, and see what that really does for us. In the first year, we have in the table, the first column, we have the year 2024 and a few projections for the out years. The amount of those purchases I mentioned earlier, 268 gigawatt hours, and the cost of those purchases is going to be about $24 million. Now that's 129% of the typical operating cost of the dam. So I'm spending more to purchase 20% of the power than we are to maintain and operate both the Parker and Davis Dam. So as you can imagine, that's a pretty devastating impact to our power customers and users within the state of Arizona. 2024, the $24 million amount is actually a relief for us. Last year, we had over $40 million in purchases for that project. Pretty substantial. Going forward, 2025 certainly looks better, $14.5 million. Of course, we're entering into the busy summer season now. Just this morning, I learned that 14 million is now $18.5 million. So it slipped by $4 million just based on future energy prices. Then in the out years, the energy markets obviously do a fairly poor job of forecasting future prices. So there's a lot of volatility. So the prices tend to be depressed. And as they come into the front years, they become a little more accurate. So we're seeing lower numbers in those out years, but still that 20% purchase rate is going to be about half the operating cost of those facilities. It's pretty significant. Okay, let's go to the next slide, please. So now let's take a little bit longer look at the total impact of this, the drought to power for both the Parker Davis and the Boulder Canyon project, better known as Hoover, of course. And on the left is Hoover Dam, in which we have a few different elements of the cost of the drought. We have the direct rate impact to our ratepayers. Obviously, the cost to operate the dams remains fairly constant. So as there's less power production, that means those customers are paying a higher effective rate. We have the replacement power on Hoover Dam. Unlike our Parker and Davis dams, our customers are required to go out on the market and make those purchases on their own. Then we have renewable energy certificates. There's a secondary market for the renewable aspect of hydropower as well as other forms of power. So that's the lost sales of that renewable piece. Greenhouse gas for folks that trade within California. Ancillary services, that's the ability to move generators up or down to accommodate market conditions, or when you turn your light switch on at home, the generators have to move up in response to that, and that can be very expensive. And resource adequacy, essentially a margin that all utilities need to keep above what they forecast for their use, kind of an emergency supply, you can think of it as. So for Hoover, over the next 6 years, we're forecasting the cost of the drought is going to be $732 million, so about $122 million per year. And that's based on Reclamation's latest 24-month study. That does not include any of the impacts of the SEIS process that we're going through today. On the right-hand side, Parker Davis, a much smaller project. There you see it's primarily that replacement power that WAPA makes on behalf of our customers to cover the shortfall and a little bit less for renewable energy certificates, but still $67 million a year. So about, $67 million over 6 years, about $11 million per year. Now, this is just the cost of the lost power itself. That doesn't include any of the trickle-down effects, the impact to agriculture, the opportunity cost, lost production for our manufacturing. And of course, as we all know, agriculture is very much impacted by water and power in Arizona, and that's a $23 billion source of the economy alone. Let's go to the next slide, please. So here we have a list of WAPA's directly affected customers within the state of Arizona. And I mentioned directly affected. These are the entities that have a contract with us for power. You know, this Arizona Power Authority is one of those. Arizona Power Authority, in turn, has approximately 50 other customers that are not listed on the slide. So the drought's impact to hydropower is pervasive. It affects all of our communities throughout Arizona, all of our forms of government, our civil groups, our municipalities, our tribes. It's quite frankly, as you know, is very devastating on the water side as well as the power side. Welcome any questions you have.
Thanks, Scott. Questions from members around the table first with Scott? Questions from anyone online, assuming we can hear you? We're not seeing any. Thanks, Scott.
Yep.
Are we ready to go back to Ed?
Can you hear me now?
So Ed Garak, if you can hear me, we'll try to go back to your presentation on the impacts of drought hydropower. Again, Ed Garak, Executive Director of AIDA.
Am I coming through now?
So they're getting your presentation up, Ed. Here we go, it's up.
I'm online, I'm unmuted, but I don't think you can still hear me. Any luck?
I just want to test if anyone in the room can hear me online.
I can hear you online.
Yes.
But nobody in the room can hear me, correct? Okay, so it's not you, Ed. Bear with us, folks. Thank you for your patience.
Ed, can you go ahead and speak into your microphone and see if we can hear you now?
Sure, Tom, how's that? Anything?
Still no.
Testing, testing. Testing, testing. Any luck?
See him.
Trying, but not coming through.
Hey, we hear you now.
Oh, huzzah.
Quit giving me the silent treatment.
Never
Thanks for your
forget, Tom.
patience,
I thought
Ed
it
and
was
everyone
late,
else.
man. The microphone might not work above 50 degrees here. It's only 46 right now. I moved away from cold weather for a reason. I wish I was with you guys.
All right, Ed, we'll get your presentation up here. We're getting to it, so we'll
Sure.
be looking forward to hearing what you have to say, as always, in our meetings. Just a sec here.
Yeah.
All right, here we go.
All right. Well, I
Thanks,
thought I'd
Ed.
switch it up a little bit and bring a little humor and perspective, so I didn't sound like Chicken Little in the sky is falling always. When I moved to Arizona in '97, nobody was really talking about drought. They were worried about the impending Y2K bug. So the reason for that is going in 1999, Paul and Mead were at 92% capacity, but over the next 22 years, the volume reduced 67% down to 25% in 2022. Next slide, please. Next couple slides just show the elevation of Powell and Mead. Basically, in the last 3 years, we got down to the lowest levels in those two reservoirs since they were both filled. Next slide, please. You can move to the next slide. The next few slides are quite a bit of graphs, water releases on the left, generation on the right. This is the compilation of the CRISP facilities. Next slide, please. So Glen Canyon Dam represents 75% of the generation of the CRISP facilities. The upstream dams are much smaller and smaller in reservoir size, but with Glen being the driver of the system, you'll see that, but it's also regulating reservoir. So you're not going to see the drastic impacts that you'll see in the lower basin dams. Next slide, please. So here is Hoover Dam. You can see in 2000, it was north of 5,200 gigawatt hours. And down as it moved down to 2023, we're just barely below 3 million gigawatt hours. So quite a significant reduction. And the next slide, please. The same is true for Davis and Parker. Next slide. And over the course of the last, since 2007, there's been a lot of initiatives taken to preserve the elevation in those dams. Helps prop up the lake levels, but it's had a direct impact on generation. Slide, please.
Ed, we just lost you again.
Okay.
Now we can hear you.
All right, next slide, please. Still coming through?
Yeah, we're going back to your presentation because we had to get out of it and go back into it. It looks like it's coming back up. All right, can you see that, Ed?
Yeah, let's stop right there.
Right.
That's
Okay.
perfect. Thank you, Tom. So this just kind of puts it in a table format what the dams have produced back in 2000. And you can move to the next slide, please. And here is the production in 2022 for the CRISP facilities in Glen Canyon, and then in Hoover in 2023. And next slide, please. This is the main point that I was hoping to get across today. You know, we've seen north of 40% reduction in generation since 2000 along the river. 41.6% from the CRISP facilities, 48.1% at Hoover. Next slide, please. And this has a direct economic impact. So we get, like Scott mentioned, we have to go out and replace that power that we no longer get from the federal facilities. This is a graph of the Palo Verde market hub from 2004 into 2018. You can see the spike after 2018. Next slide, please. And then this is a more truncated version from 2014 to today. We're seeing some radical price impacts in the market. One, the minimums have dropped quite a bit. And a lot of that is due to the influx of solar and wind. Now those are subsidized, but because of the tax subsidies, investor and tax production tax credits, you're seeing negative pricing during the middle of the day. But because of early retirements of coal and natural gas, the capacity is shrinking. So you're seeing scarcity pricing, and that's what you saw in 2019 as it ramped up in 2020. By and large, prices have increased 2 to 3 times. Max prices have increased 2 to 3 times on average over the last 5 years. Next slide, please. Some of the things we're trying to do to mitigate those strategies, we're diversifying our power portfolio. A lot of the AIDA members have signed on for a 300 megawatt solar plant. It's the Box Canyon solar plant, so that's should come online in 2025. We've pushed a bill on Capitol Hill called the Help Hoover Dam Act, and we actually are having a hearing on that tomorrow. So if that were to come to fruition, we'd be able to access about $45 million that have been tied up in the dam fund for operation, maintenance, repair. That would be equivalent to about 50% of an annual maintenance budget. Now we're probably going to spread that over a couple of years and advance some maintenance projects, capital expenditure projects at Hoover. But there's also some other legislation that we're considering. One being the Federal Land Recreation Enhancement Act. The reason I highlight that is that act actually prevents the Bureau from collecting entry fees unless you have a specific exemption. Now, Hoover gets 5 to 6 million visitors a year. That's more than the Grand Canyon, Yosemite, Yellowstone. Those are in the low or high 4 millions, but they all are able to collect entry fees. Now, the power customers have subsidized the tourism at Hoover Dam, probably in the tune of $35 million over the last 4 years due to COVID. And if we were able to charge entry fees, or another avenue might be to establish a foundation for donations to help offset some of those costs. So next slide, please. That's the crux of my presentation. Happy to answer any questions, and thank you for the opportunity.
Thanks, Ed. This is Tom. I do have one question about either of the federal laws that you put up there on the board at the end. Are any of the triggers involved in those pieces of legislation tied to the drought declaration that we may or may not recommend to the governor?
No, those both are outside of that. There is a Hydro Act that Senator Kelly sponsored that has DCP generation level triggers, but it wouldn't be specific to the your declaration of drought in the state.
Thanks, Ed. So any questions from members around the table for Ed? How about members online? Questions for Ed? All right. Thanks, Ed.
Thanks, Tom.
Move on. Thanks. We'll move on to the next presentation. And it's Carly McClellan from the Navajo Nation Department of Water Resources, senior hydrologist. Impacts of drought on the Navajo Nation. Carly, hopefully you're with us and you can hear us, and we'll be able to hear you. Go ahead, Carly.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Is everyone able to hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you for having me on. My name is Carly McClellan. I'm with the Navajo Nation Water Management Branch. So let's go ahead and jump into the slides. So our program, it's known as water monitoring inventory, and just some of the things that we do primarily focus on surface water monitoring. And so we do have some historical data that we've been collecting over the years, and then we've had a few changes that we've been going through over the past few years. And so some of the things that we're working on is doing some upgrades. And so, but since the upgrades haven't happened yet, we have kind of our data that's collaged everywhere. So we're working on trying to make some improvements. So that kind of sometimes affects some of the the physical data that we have. And so I think because of during this transitionary period, we're relying a lot more on a kind of a both dual in situ data, and we're also relying heavily also on remote sensing. So I just kind of wanted to mention that. Next slide. So altogether, throughout Navajo Nation, we have 85 rain cans. We check on a monthly basis, and that's just a breakdown. But next slide. And then this slide there is just to give you a visual of the locations of our rain cans. Next slide. So I put together just an outlook, or looking back on the past 6 months, the 6-month SBI to most current up to May 1st of this year. And they're looking at them by Navajo Nation agencies. So next slide. So just looking at Chinle Agency, you can see that 6 months ago, we're looking at about around roughly a -2 6-month SPI, which has some pretty good improvements over this winter comparatively to, we're at least in the roughly plus 0.5 SPI, 6-month SPI. So good to see improvements there. Next slide. This one's for Eastern Navajo. Again, we see some improvements there, similar to Chinle Agency. Next slide. This one here is for Fort Defiance Agency, and I think overall a lot of the trends that we've seen are going to be very similar, and I think a lot of that's inherent of the more large-scale winter fronts that we've been seeing this past winter, which is not always the case with summer monsoons. Summer monsoons sometimes tend to be a little more isolated, and so sometimes the overall trends from agency to agency, sometimes they can vary more. Whereas sometimes with the winter, they sometimes have a little bit more common improvements, just because of the winter fronts kind of move a little bit more over a larger region as to. So, all right, next slide. So this one's Shiprock Agency. Again, similar improvements there as well. Next slide. And then this one is for Western Navajo. This one's a little bit more interesting. Had some improvements and a drop, and then another improvement there. So Western Navajo tends to be a little bit more probably the driest of all the agencies, in terms of precipitation and whatnot. So next slide. So, just some of the areas that they're impacted with drought on Navajo Nation is, oftentimes goes beyond, just people using water and utility companies that pump water, but also looking at just the general population. We have a lot of people that still don't have running water, so we have a lot of people that haul water, and so and then there's other areas that I don't really cover, like drought as it relates to aquifer levels and and recharge rates in the aquifers and stuff like that. And obviously, one of the trends that we've seen is that, definitely here on Navajo Nation, and probably in other areas as well, we're definitely pumping more water than what's naturally being recharged. Drought also affects a lot of our farm board members and dryland farmers, and and then here on Navajo Nation, we do have a lot of people who have livestock as well, and so we do have other issues like other natural resource issues like overgrazing, and so we have issues with feral horses and whatnot, and those feral horses and livestock sometimes compete against wildlife and of course other areas of recreation like lakes for fishing and whatnot, and forestry. I'm not going to really get into it, but we've just also seen a lot of observations of our forests where a lot of bark beetle infestation just because of the lack of precipitation, and the trees aren't able to produce enough sap to combat against a lot of these things. So just kind of wanted to cover a little more on this. Next slide. So on our 2003 drought contingency plan, I just wanted to focus primarily on some of the drought indices that we focus on, and I think going forward in the future, some of the we do want to incorporate and add other indices and look at more evapotranspiration indices like SPEI and EDI and whatnot. But currently, the primary focus of the Navajo Nation drought contingency plan, as far as drought metrics are concerned and drought indices, the 6-month SPI is predominantly the only thing that's looked at, but it's probably not, obviously from my experience, it's my observations, it's not the best and only metric to look at. I think looking at other indices, and then no one indice will tell you everything, but looking at all the indices, you get a little bit more of a better insight to the drought impacts. So next slide. And then, kind of what I mentioned earlier with just goes to show here that in the drought contingency plan, there's a little section in that booklet that shows a flow chart, and this is just it pretty much mimics what you see in the U.S. Drought Monitor's D0 to D4 scale. Very similar, and so it looks like that's just the scale of depending on where the 6-month SBI falls, then those are the different Navajo Nation alert stages where you'll have normal, alert, warning, and emergency. So next slide. And again, that's just showing some additional pages of the drought contingency plan that shows that emergency drought declaration is when the SBI 6-month SBI is less than a -1.5. Next slide. So I also wanted to, we have a total of 8 snowtail sites. I'm sorry, 8 snow courses. 2 of the snow courses have snowtail sites. One of them is Beaver Springs, and the other is Whiskey Creek. But I only included some graphs from one snowtail, which is kind of representative of all the snowtail sites. So that's why I only included just one site. Also, just currently, we are also working with, I just wanted to mention that we're also working with the Utah NRCS office. And hopefully, if all goes well, we're working on trying to establish a new snowtail site on the top of Navajo Mountain. And so we're excited on the possibilities of that. So if that goes through, that would be a great addition to have a much more wider range of spatial and temporal snowpack for Navajo Nation. Because there are 6 major mountain ranges on Navajo Nation. We only focus predominantly on the Cheska Mountains and one snow course on the fluted rock, or the Defiance Plateau rather. And there's 4 other mountain ranges that we just don't have the manpower to go out there and monitor all those. So looking at other options, like we've just as a side note, we've also looked at working with other universities to try to put in low cost radar snow monitors that just look at snow depth and stuff like that. But a lot of the funding that we've been pursuing for those have just been not coming through, but perhaps someday. But so focusing just on Beaver Springs Snowtell site for water year 2023 and 2024. So next slide. So this one here is from last year. I just wanted to make a comparison because last year we had that flooding that happened in Chinle, and we had FEMA that was out in Chinle area, and it was a pretty bad fiasco there with all the flooding that happened last year in the Chinle area. And I think looking at some historical data, we've had much larger snowpacks than 2023. It's just that the only difference is that I think last year, on average, our April 1st snow surveys, we were averaging 5 feet of snow on pretty much all the snow courses along the Cheska Mountains. And although in previous years we've had more, it just, I think part of what contributed to the flooding in Chinle was that what was the major difference is that in previous years, we've always had kind of like a slow, gradual warming. And 2023 was the first calendar year where we just had this rapid warm up. And we had, from that rapid warm up, just created the perfect storm, so to speak, for the flooding. And so, like I said, in previous years, we had kind of a slower warm up, so the snow melt was a little bit more slow and gradual. So looking at 2023, the peak is roughly 70 inches for Beaver Springs. Just wanted to make note of that. Next slide. And so looking at this year, you're looking at the peak, we're right at about 40, which when you compare that to last year, we were at 70, and this year we're at 40. So pretty close to half of the snowpack compared to last year. So there was no issue of flooding in the Chinle area this year. I know that everybody was worried again, but we just didn't have the snowpack for it. So that gives you a little bit of an idea what's happening in terms of snow on Navajo Nation. So I just wanted to include these two slides for a little bit of insight regarding that. Next slide. And then this is just the U.S. Drought Monitor, the latest May 4th map for Navajo Nation. So, I think a lot of the drought degradation that we've seen over the past 6 months are pretty much shown with those graphs that I showed earlier of by agencies, where we had the improvements of the 6-month SBIs, and we see certain areas on Western Navajo where we're at like a D0 or none rather, and then most of the Navajo Nation is at a D0, and Eastern is at a D2. But I think, seeing these improvements are perhaps temporary. Only time will tell. But we'll see what the monsoons bring. Hopefully, we're able to have a reasonable monsoon this year. But that concludes my presentation, and I'm open to any questions if there are any.
Thank you, Carly. Questions from members around the table first? Seeing none. Questions from members online? Seeing none. Thanks, Carly. We'll move on to the last presentation then, impacts of drought on the Gila River Indian community. Jason Howder, Water Council for the community, will lead us through that presentation. Jason, can you hear us?
I can, Tom. Thank you very much. You can
Great.
hear me, I'm assuming.
Yes, go ahead, Jason.
I'll try to keep this short and sweet. I tend to keep this presentation short. I think for 2024, I think for the community, this is a period of uncertainty given as the state engages in the basin-wide discussions concerning post-2026 Colorado River operations. Many water users, including the community, are eager to find consensus within the basin and develop operations that create stability in the system. So we expect to have to adjust to the new normal, just not quite sure what that is yet. So needless to say, the community expects to be impacted in one way or the other. But really, this presentation will focus on past conservation activity and also touch on some of our community's concerns and focus, future focus. So with respect to this slide, the community's I think I've mentioned this in the past, its most at-risk supply is CAP water, and that's because the CAP water in terms of water supply for the state is a lower priority water within the Colorado River system. The community's largest entitlement holder. It really has 2 pots of water within the CAP, a little over 191,000 acre feet of more senior Indian M&I priority, and a little over 120,000 acre feet of lower priority NIA priority. I think that it's really the NIA priority CAP water that is most at risk, and the community is most in terms of the post 2026 operations, is really trying to find ways to mitigate that risk, whether that's the replacement or some other way of mitigating the potential impacts to that supply. Next slide, please. So I mentioned this uncertainty. There's nothing guaranteed yet, and right now there's no consensus in terms of what the post 2026 operations will look like. But the community is planning to have CAP supplies reduced in some manner. So we're working to be able to adjust to this new normal, whatever that looks like. I think one of the things to keep in mind is that in the past, under the current interim guidelines and under the drought contingency plan, much of the larger system conservation efforts that have been needed to stabilize reservoir elevations, basically the actions above and beyond the reductions required under the interim guidelines, DCP, those actions have been done on a voluntary basis by water users, usually through paid system conservation, but also through the creation of ICS, or potentially create surplus. And those efforts have really helped stabilize reservoir levels and continue to do so. If you look at looking in the future, I think what the community is anticipating is that there's a consensus that rather than increasing cuts as you drop in elevation, having a more front-loaded approach where you're trying to address the supply-demand imbalance, or commonly referred to as the structural deficit, and address that in most situations. So there's a 1.5 million acre foot cut in most situations, which is likely to impact CAP water supplies. So this essentially means really that to address and try to help stabilize the system, you're shifting from more of a voluntary kind of system conservation approach for these larger cuts to a more mandatory regulatory cuts. And so what does this mean from the community? This likely means that there's less water available for voluntary conservation coming from CAP water users, because it's likely that many of the water users that do, like the community that do voluntarily conserve their water, that those supplies are likely to be impacted and be already kind of helping the system under these regulatory cuts. And so any new voluntary conservation will likely have to come from, I think still some CAP water users may participate, but not to the level they have in the past. And you're gonna have to look at senior water rights holders, and those rights tend to be higher value and more expensive. So system conservation in the future may be a more expensive prospect. For the community's own domestic purposes, the community is really focusing on ways to protect its underground water supplies and other non-Colorado River supplies like those that it gets from the Gila River. So those are just some thoughts to share in terms of how the community is looking at what the possible future is. Next slide. So just some past recent conservation activity. So through 2023, the community has contributed a little over, about 725,000 acre feet to Lake Mead. This year, the community was likely to conserve a little over 124,000 acre feet under the LC conservation program, which has been funded under the Inflation Reduction Act. So by the end of this year, the community will be approaching 900,000 acre feet of conservation or cut of some sort of its CEP water. So that breakdown really is kind of approximately 400,000 of that has come or will come from compensated system conservation, a little over 300,000 of ICS creation, and then 175,000 acre feet of DCP cuts, some of which have been mitigated, but some of which have not. Next slide. And this is just a graphical illustration of this. I think this is an interesting slide. The blue is system conservation. It's interesting to kind of show the effects of cuts and the DCP and the difference between a tier 1 shortage condition and a tier 3. So the blue is system conservation, voluntary system conservation. The green is ICS, and the orange are DCP reductions. And so in 2022, we were in a tier, the second to last bar there, we were in a tier 1 shortage condition, but you can see the difference to the community when we shifted in 2023 to a tier 2 shortage condition, and you have a much larger cut. Almost the entire supply of the community's 120,000 acre feet of NIA water was eliminated under that tier 2A cut. This year we're in a tier 1 shortage condition, so will likely look something like we did in 2022. But just wanted to show that the difference between the reductions in comparison to the different DCP shortage conditions. Next slide. So I think in terms of what the community has done in response to the drought, really for us, as the focus has been in Colorado River Basin, is really to curtail its off-reservation storage activities and shift more water to Lake Mead. Really starting in 2010, that's when the community really was starting to store or begin storage of its surplus CAP supplies to create long-term storage credits. And then once the DCP discussions started, it started to shift more of its water to Lake Mead for system conservation or ICS. Like I said, it remains to be seen what the post-2026 outcome will be, but the community is very engaged in these discussions and in this process. As I said, there's not consensus yet. I think that creates a challenge in terms of forecasting what the future will be. So the community, I think, is kind of planning to reduce its reliance on CAP water, but also trying to find ways to, hopefully lessen the impact to Arizona supplies, particularly in the CAP system. So it remains to be seen exactly what that'll look like. long-term, the community's on-reservation plans are to continue to increase its ag activities. It's the purpose of its settlement. And to be able to do that, long-term, it's going to have to look at other water supplies, and we're essentially planning not to have, on any regular basis, non-Indian ag priority CAP water to meet those supplies. So that last bullet is a little bit of that's an incorrect. I don't know if it's a miscite or a wishful thinking, or maybe a combination of the couple. I think really the point of this last bullet is really the community is really focused. The other thing it's focused on is on-reservation infrastructure and water efficiency projects. So I think today it's announcing its kind of the installation of solar over canal. One of its projects, its pilot projects on reservation. It's recently under the bipartisan infrastructure law. Was it last year? It was awarded $83 million to construct a reclaimed water pipeline so it could more use its exchange water with the city's reclaimed water, A+ treated reclaimed water with the cities of Chandler and Mesa, and kind of use that in more parts of the reservation. And so that project will be done. I think first water deliveries from that project will be done in October. And it's also put in proposals under the Inflation Reduction Act, regulatory reservoirs, some canal lining, and some on-farm efficiencies projects. And we think we have very good proposals, and we're very optimistic about eventually being awarded and having that confirmed. I think a lot of water users in the state are kind of waiting to hear back from reclamation. It's taken some time, but we expect that announcement to take place in June. So I think from the community standpoint, it's really planning to stretch its non-CAP water uses more within for its domestic purposes, and really ways to protect those water rights, and then trying to figure out a way to ensure that there's some CAP water to use. But I think whatever comes out of the post-2026 process, it'll be a new normal, a different way of dealing with things, particularly with CAP water users. So that's all I have, and happy to answer any questions.
Thanks, Jason. Questions from members around the table for Jason? Seeing none. Questions from members for Jason? Thanks, Jason. I'll just mention, as we move forward into more certainty about post-2026, this group probably will be hearing impacts of the water supplies available after 2026 on entities like the Gila River community and others. There are some other tribes and cities who will be impacted as well if we end up with a plan that solves the structural deficit on a regular basis. So more to come on that one. And as Jason said, there's lots of alternatives out there for post-2026 that Reclamation is analyzing right now, with a goal towards a draft environmental impact statement in December of this year. So with that, we'll move to the next agenda item, and that item is to consider a recommendation to the governor to maintain or not the current drought emergency declaration. So I'll take the liberty of kind of summarizing some of the key points that we've heard to date in all the presentations. So I think the short-term drought has been a bit of a mixed bag in Arizona. There's been some improvement in some places and not improvement in others. We're seeing El Nino building, which will likely lead to a dry winter next winter. We heard potentially that we're going to have a dry monsoon this summer. We're seeing clearly in the long term impacts of the drought and drought projections, a hotter and drier future and projected drier conditions because of that hotter world we're living in. We know we have Colorado River supply issues, as we heard, and we're going to have a below average runoff this water year. We heard that there are high fuel loads and high fire risks, and that we've already had almost 20,000 more acres burned this year than last year. We heard from Jason and Carly about the issues with the Navajo Nation and the Gila Indian community that they're facing. So for me, in summary, I think it, especially for the longer term outlook, results in, from my viewpoint, again, making a recommendation to the governor to continue the drought declaration. And I'll turn it over to the members. We usually do this more by head nodding and acclamation. If there are folks who want to add to my summary, if I've missed any key points, be certainly happy to hear from the members in that regard. Looking around the table, I think I have head nods in agreement regarding making that recommendation to the governor. I'll turn to the folks online that are members. Does anyone want to add to my summary? Do any of the members online disagree with my view and of making a recommendation to maintain the drought declaration? You can raise hands, you can go in the chat. We're not seeing anything, so I will take silence as acquiescence and we'll move forward. We'll direct staff to write the normal recommendation letter to the governor to maintain the drought declaration in place. We can move to the next agenda item, which is a call to the public. Any of the public want to address any of the items we've talked about today? Not hearing any and not seeing any online. I want to thank again all the members of the group for not only attendance today and the presentations, but I know a lot of the heavy lifting is done behind the scenes in the committee meetings that go on all year round. Again, want to thank you all for your participation. These drought challenges that are in front of us are going to continue as we continue to see more impacts from climate change and our warming Western United States. So we'll look forward to seeing all of you at the fall meeting, tentatively in the month of November, and we'll start looking for dates and let you all know when we're going to target the date for the next meeting. And with that, I think we can adjourn. Thank you, everyone, and we're only 1 minute late.